Great stuff. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our interactive strategy session today. Thanks all for joining. And today, as I think you all be aware, we're talking about future-proof your business with data modernization. I'm Niall Quinn, and I'll be your host today. So over the last few years, cloud has evolved into a critical enabler for businesses, and with AI and machine learning driving a new era of migrations and system updates, simply rehosting infrastructure alone won't unlock the full potential of these platforms. In today's interactive session, our data expert Matthew Robertshaw will guide you through the key steps to modernising your data systems. You'll discover why this process is essential, how to select the right Azure SQL options, and practical ways to reduce costs while ensuring a smooth, secure transition to modern systems. Plus, we'll explore some real-world examples of businesses that have already reaped the benefits of data modernisation. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Matt. Over to you.
Thanks, Niall. Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Brilliant. Yeah, morning everybody. So my name is Matt Robertshaw, so I'm the head of technical delivery here at Coio. So for the most part, that means I'm providing some technical oversight across some of our projects, manage a team of talented consultants, and also providing some support to the sales team in shaping and scoping new deals and new work. So as Niall mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit today about data modernization and sharing with you some of our own experiences of taking clients on that journey and where we've managed to sort of get them. Just a little bit about Coio first, and who are we? So many of you have probably heard of Coio before, but just so you know, we're sort of 80 to 100 people in size. We've been going for about 15 years. We were founded in 2007 by two ex-Microsoft employees who identified that there were lots of clients that needed help and support in the area of SQL Server and BI, and ultimately that formed from Coio out of that need. We are a Microsoft solutions partner as well, so we specialize in data and AI specifically, and also Azure infrastructure too. We've got some great achievements over the time as well. So we've got sort of great client retention of around 97%. We have offices here in Reading, Thames Valley Park, and we've also set up an offshore capability as well, which in Hyderabad, which we use to essentially support our delivery and support teams. And we've also got a range of awards as well. For sort of 2 or 3 years on the trot, we've been winning the Great Place to Work schemes as well. So yeah, a little bit about Coio there in case you didn't know who we were. So what do we do? So ultimately, we provide solutions that really harness the power of data for informed decision making. Really, we are a Microsoft data and analytics partner, so we specialize in AI, generative AI, machine learning, analytics, and obviously data platform or SQL. And we deliver end-to-end data strategy and execution, really, including planning, governance, data platform, data visualization, analytics, AI, along with operational support as well, we can deliver out of our managed services team. And we believe that there are, we believe that great business outcomes are really paramount to that, and the strategy without action is pointless in many ways. And we believe there are 4 good reasons why clients choose to work with us. 1, we are Microsoft focused, so we are a committed team of Microsoft data experts. 2, we are actionable, so we lead with practical actionable insights. We're not biased to any action, but we're not just strategizing. We build up, do the whole thing through and through. We are rapid in terms of how we use our IP to accelerate our delivery. We have a number of solution accelerators which can get you from 0 to something in a relatively short period of time, and then obviously achieve early business value. And 4, we are innovative. So we've got a commitment to continuous improvement and really keeping abreast of the latest technology innovations as well. So a little bit about Coio there. Who we work with lots of different clients across different sectors. So, our sweet spots are certainly in financial services, insurance, retail, and other professional services organisations as well, such as legal and construction and whatnot. So, probably lots of brands on there that you've seen before, but certainly a good example there of some of the clients that we currently work with, or certainly worked with previously. Great. Okay, so I suppose a bit of a question on sort of a bit of a point of where we are today. So I suppose during the pandemic and even before then, we saw lots of businesses lifting and shifting to Azure, and at that point, certainly during the pandemic, it was time critical, and even before then, businesses were looking to move into Azure to get out of contracts and whatnot. But I think over the last few years, cloud has become an enabler for many businesses, and whether to go to the cloud is no longer a debate for the most part. I think generally businesses understand the need to go, and for those that have, lifted closer to that cloud native platform. But ultimately, you don't save money or improve productivity by rehosting all of your IaaS infrastructure in Azure. So really, cloud is now it's sort of leading a wave of new migrations and modernization scenarios that are spurred on by generative AI, and machine learning. And ultimately, today, businesses are also facing large costs and cost pressures and whatnot, and optimizing spend, whether that's in the cloud or whether it's in other scenarios or situations, is an important factor. Why spend any more than you need to? So this talk is as much about the options, but also provides some pragmatic advice around how you might go about saving money as well on those on that investment. The other elephant in the room, of course, is the ongoing partnership that we see with OpenAI and Microsoft. Obviously, today businesses and organizations are looking for ways to embed generative AI and machine learning within their own businesses and applications, and out of that there are lots and lots of use cases as well. So really the reality today is that we migrate and modernize to Azure so that we get closer to these models, and these can then enable future analytics and AI and machine learning opportunities and initiatives. So you might be wondering, what are some of the drivers for moving to Azure, but not just moving, but also modernizing those workloads as well. Based on our own experience of taking clients on the journey of migration through to modernization, there are lots of different reasons why we find clients are going on that journey. A really sort of good example, very early example, is data center contract expiring. So many organizations, many businesses are looking to move to the cloud because ultimately their data center contracts were literally just expiring, or the costs were going up, and all kinds of other factors as well there. So that's one of the main reasons, and generally that's a time critical factor. So in those scenarios, clients need to move relatively quickly, otherwise they'll face cost extensions onto the contracts, which may or may not, which could be more if they're doing it month by month. So that's a really good example. Urgent capacity needs was obviously something we saw a lot of during the pandemic. So anyone that tried to deploy anything to some of the cloud providers during the pandemic was probably found that it was quite challenging at times. So when we need to expand capacity, whether it's for availability or performance, then that's another good example there, and that quite often leads to hybrid type deployments as well. Software hardware refresh is another good example. Obviously, some clients aren't willing to spend any more money on on-premises hardware, whether it's SAN, server infrastructure, whatever that might be, and obviously looking to review options outside of their own data estates there. Extended security updates is another good example. So for quite some time, Microsoft will provide you with extended security updates by moving essentially unsupported versions of SQL Server and Windows Server into Azure, and on the basis of that you do that, they will then continue to provide you with extended security updates as well. So that's a benefit that they introduced for Windows 2008, I think for 2012 R2 as well, which I think you can still do. So that's obviously another good example there. So some scenarios there around, you know, what drivers around migration. When it comes to modernization, we're talking a little bit more about, you know, essentially replatforming, not necessarily rehosting, but replatforming the workload and the application. And there are lots of good examples here as well. So, you know, cost optimization is a probably quite a good example where, you know, quite often running IaaS workloads in Azure is actually quite expensive. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, you don't just save money by moving those, you know, that tin essentially into Azure. You kind of need to replatform in many ways. So cost optimization is a very good one, because ultimately that allows us to rethink and redevelop the application possibly from the ground up, and that's kind of where application innovation comes in as well. Faster time to market is another really good example. You know, it's very easy to essentially, you know, rightly or wrongly, very easy to spin up new workloads in Azure using a lot of PaaS services, and that just means that, you know, we've got better flexibility when it comes to deployment and creating pipelines to deploy various pieces of work and whatnot. So we can spin up environments very quickly, we can spin them down also quite quickly. So it just means we can get going with something quite, you know, to market with a small time frame. So that's another good example. And you know, reducing total cost of ownership is another big factor as well. If we can, you know, move from, let's say, moving a SQL server that requires some maintenance and patching and all the other bits and pieces that go along with, you know, maintaining SQL Server, moving to a PaaS native platform like SQL Managed Instance or SQL Database, or perhaps even a NoSQL solution, that essentially improves the manageability aspect, and therefore reduces the sort of your own total cost of ownership, because you no longer need to worry about patching, you don't need to worry about backups, because a lot of that is taken care of on the underlying platform. So, you know, the time saving there means that, you know, people can spend more time on impactful initiatives that obviously, you know, really turn the dial for the business. So ultimately some good examples there around, on drivers there around migration and modernization, ultimately based on our own experience. Okay, so a little bit about your options when it comes to Azure SQL. So what I've done here is try to break down sort of the three main options that you've got, and some of these may be new to you, some of these that may not be, and many of you may be using these workloads today in lots of different ways. Obviously, we've spoken a bit about infrastructure as a service, and that's essentially moving your own SQL VMs into Azure. You know, these are full SQL versions in the cloud. Obviously, very simplified licensing costs as well, because ultimately, you know, for the most part, it's pay as you go, unless you decide to use hybrid benefit. Geographic flexibility in the sense that actually we can deploy these anywhere. It's a very mature workload and actually available in all regions. The SQL IaaS extension also makes it easy for you to essentially automate various things like backups and patching, and also key vault integration as well if you need to securely store secrets. So there are, you know, lots of bits and pieces there that essentially, whilst it's still an IaaS deployment, there are still things that help you along the way. The IaaS agent extension are a really good one, actually. When it comes to our platform as a service or PaaS workloads, we've got a couple of options. Obviously, we've got SQL Managed Instance and SQL Database. What we've seen a lot of in recent, I would probably say over the last 12 to 18 months, is you know, clients looking to move to SQL Managed Instance, because ultimately it gives them the sort of the flexibility of being able to deploy a PaaS solution without worrying about the underlying infrastructure and maintaining that, but also the full capability of what they might get if they had SQL Server on a VM in the first place. So actually, the chasm that exists or used to exist between SQL IaaS and SQL PaaS is actually now minimized in many ways, and you know, the first point on the slide there is, you know, there's broad SQL compatibility now between SQL Managed Instance and SQL version or SQL and VMs, and in many ways Microsoft will land new features and new capabilities into their own PaaS workloads before they end up making it onto the box product. So you know, if you deploy SQL Managed Instance, you're generally safe in the knowledge that, you know, you're always going to be at the leading edge of, you know, SQL essentially SQL features within that are coming out of Microsoft ultimately. And obviously, you know, whether you choose to use them is down to you. Obviously, Microsoft's not going to force you to put something, you know, or use something if obviously it's not right for your workload. So you still have the flexibility to be able to turn features on and off if you don't believe, or use them if you don't believe they are, you know, at a point where they're acceptable to use yet. It's a fully managed service, so no patching, no hardware maintenance, and also backups are, you know, taken care of as well. There is obviously reduced TCO, as I think we've already mentioned before. You know, we don't have to worry about, you know, some of the other manual activities that we might have to do previously, like patching. High availability is built into the platform as well. So ultimately, you know, when you deploy a SQL managed instance, you might be deploying one SQL managed instance, but behind the scenes, Microsoft will replicate that 3 to 4 times within the region ultimately, or within the zone, depending on obviously what you select. So ultimately, Microsoft will provide that built-in HA on the back end for you, so you don't need to worry about setting up additional, you know, failover cluster nodes or availability group nodes, whatever that might be, as you would do with SQL Server on VMs. And finally, there's an exclusive hybrid Azure hybrid benefit as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But ultimately, Microsoft provide you with the ability to reuse your enterprise or standard core licenses that you might have purchased or bought, and use that to license essentially the SQL managed instance workloads in Azure, and that can trigger some pretty sizable cost savings, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Finally, SQL database, or Azure SQL database. Certainly, you know, one of the probably early deployments of SQL actually, and actually it was, you know, we go back to the beginning. Azure SQL database was one of the early features of Azure, so it's very mature in the sense it's been around for years, but ultimately in that time it's evolved, and there's lots of different flavors and scalability factors that, you know, you can consider now when using SQL database, but ultimately it's always going to generally provide you with with very optimal running costs ultimately. If we need to scale it, we can easily do that horizontally or vertically, whether it's through sharding or increasing scale, whatever. So there are lots of different ways that we can deploy SQL database to, meet our own performance needs. And like SQL managed instance, it's fully managed as well. So, there are automated backups, it's automated patching, built-in HA, and then obviously turnkey DR if we need to, deploy essentially another database across to another region. And the same applies there to SQL managed instance as well. If we need to have DR between different regions, then we can easily do that using that particular feature. So 3 good options there. Certainly, the latter 2 are, targeted more at modernisation, I should say. Okay, so when to use what? So, there are also different scenarios where clients will, the clients will come to us and ask, when they should use what, and what scenario works best when. And generally there's some sort of high-level rules that we typically follow, and this eventually allows us to arrive at a particular answer. So Azure SQL Virtual Machines is a great one to use when we need to get going quickly. So if we know that in the next 3 to 6 months we have got an application or a workload that needs to be moved out of the data center, whether it's because the contract's expiring, or whether it's because it needs to be moved there for archival purposes, or it's a legacy app that just needs to be moved and forgotten about, then we would generally pick SQL Virtual Machine, SQL VMs. If there are no strict performance needs, and the app doesn't support, PaaS alternatives, again, SQL VMs are, a good option, and that's quite common. There are still some legacy applications that, are out there, and probably many more than what you think, that won't still yet allow you to deploy. The vendors won't allow you to deploy those application databases onto things like managed instance or SQL database. So SQL virtual machines still very much have a place for some of the sort of more legacy applications, or applications that don't yet support PaaS alternatives. It's rare now, but there are still some applications out there that require OS components, or local components installing on the OS. I've not had that for quite a while, but that has come up previously. or if we've got an instance where we need more than 500 databases on one instance. So right now, we can have lots and lots of databases, thousands of databases in a SQL VM. But when it comes to Azure SQL managed instance, the limit is 100 databases per SQL MI, but you can have up to 500 databases on a next gen general purpose SQL MI, which is currently in preview. So if many of you or any of you are running Azure SQL managed instances today, then certainly it's something to have a look at in that you could look at moving to next gen general purpose if obviously there are you want to deploy more databases on a particular instance. There are also other benefits around the next gen general purpose instance as well, around performance and scalability. So generally has better throughput, and there are essentially managed disks that sit behind the scenes. So there are lots of improvements coming to SQL MI. So that's currently in preview. I'm not entirely sure when it's going to be go GA yet, but that's something to consider. So anyway, a little bit off tangent there, but ultimately Azure SQL virtual machines are a good example for very quick lift and shift style migrations that perhaps got some legacy workloads and databases. I think SQL managed instance now will be our preferred option. I think when we're talking to clients, usually because of all the PaaS benefits it has, right? So we've already mentioned there's no need to patch. Microsoft will obviously maintain all of the back-end infrastructure, so you don't need to worry about that. You don't have to ever do a SQL upgrade again, right? You can maintain that same SQL version. Also, you can stay on SQL managed instance, knowing that you're always going to have the latest features. Now, the caveat there is that ultimately you are still responsible for your database compatibility level. So every database, as you probably know, has a compatibility level, and the compatibility level determines some of the features that are available. Now, Microsoft will essentially, as it releases versions of SQL Server, it will obviously add new versions or new compatibility levels to SQL managed instance. Now, Microsoft won't ever just upgrade a database compatibility level without you knowing, right? So that you are in very much control of that, because obviously you'll need to test any new changes and ensure that everything's compatible before you change the compatibility level. But from a sort of perspective of being on the latest version, then that when you're on a SQL managed instance, you're always going to be on that you're always going to be on the latest version of the product, but obviously the compatibility levels are something you'll just need to keep an eye on yourself. We don't want to worry about any hardware refreshes anymore. Again, that's something I mentioned earlier. That Microsoft take care of all that back for us. And I think the point around less than 500 databases is a key one. I've not worked with many clients that have got, I have worked with a few clients that have got thousands of databases on one instance, but I don't think I'd recommend that either. But ultimately what Microsoft are trying to do is, get to a point where, managed instances flexible enough to allow for, clients with large numbers of databases on an instance to move. And obviously, if you've got any more than 500 databases on a single SQL VM today, then the chances are you might need to scale those out if you go to SQL MI, for example. So, but there are cost implications in doing that as well. So this is where essentially a balance and a little bit of pragmatism needs to come into play ultimately. But certainly for clients that shard their databases, they get to excess of 500 databases very, very quickly. In some places, I've worked with clients that have got over 10,000 databases on one instance. I'm not saying that's a good thing to do, but it's just the reality of how they've architected their application, their solution, and that's essentially how it works. Finally, Azure SQL database, great. And for any new greenfield database workloads or an application that requires a database backend, I would always recommend a SQL database, or perhaps Postgres or MySQL, whatever that might be, but essentially a standalone database backend, because ultimately, lots of reasons. One, it's very easy from a dev test perspective, because it can be, we can throw away quite quickly. We can get going quite quickly, so we can deploy a database, an Azure SQL database, relatively quickly. We don't need to stand up a virtual machine with all the infrastructure. We don't need to go through the setup process for a SQL MI. standing up a new database in an Azure SQL DB is relatively quick. It's also great for scenarios where we need to shard or scale out horizontally rather than vertically. So that's another great use case. Some of you may have heard of elastic pools as well, which is also an interesting concept. So obviously that basically means that with a single data, we can deploy a set of databases into a pool of resources, and those databases share those resources, and we can, that can then the databases will then use whatever resource it needs based on the workload at the time. So there are generally some rules to follow when doing that. If we have let's say 10 databases that we want to put into an elastic pool, what we want to ensure is that those databases don't all peak in terms of their performance at the same time, because the elastic pool has a finite number of resources, and if they all peak at the same time, then the chances are they're not going to they're not going to perform well. So you kind of need to pick databases that peak at different times to benefit from that particular architecture. Other good examples are offloading reads. So I worked with a client a few years ago that had a requirement to essentially have a small reporting database for some reports that they didn't want to use the main or the primary instance for. So we set up replication from the SQL server to an Azure SQL database, and then they were able to point the reports at that database and do the reporting from there. So that's also quite another nice example. And then finally, we want a managed platform, and it's exactly the same benefits of the SQL MI. No patching, no maintenance, the backups are taken care of. So lots of good examples and there around when to use SQL database. So yeah, few examples there of when to use which particular deployment, but hopefully that gives you a feel for the options, and ultimately also a lot of them might resonate with you as well, and many of you may be using them today as well. So that's all good. Okay, and can I save money? Well, the answer here is yes. You can save money in Azure. Many of you have probably heard of the Azure hybrid benefit, and basically that means that we can reuse our core licenses in Azure. And when I say reuse the ones that we may be already using on premises, or we might be using to pay for other SQL workloads in Azure. Now, this requires active SA or active software assurance coverage. And basically, the table there shows you how you can exchange those core licenses. So why this is exclusive to Azure is that you'll see at the bottom there, one Enterprise Edition core license will give you 4 general purpose vCores, and that can be used for Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance. So you can see there you get a 4 times, you get a ×4 benefit of a single core license when you're moving to something like Azure SQL Managed Instance. So that's a really good cost saving from a licensing perspective, and it ultimately could mean that you end up in a position where you move to Azure, and actually you don't need potentially as many enterprise core edition licenses that you can then true down on. So there is definitely a cost saving in going to Azure, but there's also the opportunity to reduce existing license spend as well when it comes to your true down. And reserved instances is another great feature or a great option as well. So many of you will know that reserved instances allows you to reserve, or I should say save, on your compute. So essentially it means you pay upfront or pay a discounted rate per month, but obviously over a 1 or a 3 year commitment. Now obviously you can exit that, but there are generally there'll be fees to pay, or there'll be a charge for that generally, depending on when you decide to exit that. But ultimately reserved instances allows you to save money on the compute. The thing to be aware of when we're talking about resources in Azure, certainly from the SQL perspective, is that there are 3 key costs when it comes to these deployments. So your licensing, your storage, and your compute. Now, hybrid benefit obviously saves money on your licensing. Reserved instances saves money on your compute. So that means that storage in these scenarios is still billed separately. One of the things to think about as well is when you're reserving workloads is how long you reserve them for. Obviously, you've got options for 1 or 3 years. So if you know that the workload is going to exist for a long period of time, then obviously maximize that and go for 3 years. But if it's tactical, it's likely not going to be around for another, year or so, then, a year is probably sufficient. Anything that you pay in addition to what you reserve. So let's say you've reserved your compute at a particular SKU or tier, but actually you need to scale up, or you need to go beyond that because, let's say, I don't know, it could be Black Friday, or it could be some peak event that requires you to scale that workload. Then essentially anything that you go over that reservation or tier, you'll pay burst capacity, so you'll just pay for the overage separately, which is, so it still gives you the flexibility to scale if you need to. You'll just have to pay for that when you do. So combining reserved instances with Azure Hybrid Benefit gives you some pretty significant savings. So if you look at that sort of chart there, by using RIs independently will give you a 70% cost, 72%-ish cost saving when compared to pay as you go. But when you combine Hybrid Benefit and RIs, that gives you an 80% saving. So I think the lesson here is if you can navigate these benefits, you can really take advantage of some pretty big cost savings. And ultimately, it's all about knowing, A, that they exist, and B, how they apply to your own organization as to whether or not you benefit from these. So, as a takeaway, I would definitely suggest that you look into, whether A, you're using this today, and B, whether it's something you could take advantage of. Okay, so how do I go about conducting environment discovery? So when we work with clients in this space, we generally always start with an Azure migration assessment or using Azure Migrate. And that, if you don't know, is basically a platform that exists. It's a PaaS native platform that exists in Azure, and it allows us to conduct a discovery exercise of your environment ultimately. There are a number of different tools for discovery and assessment, and some different scenarios as well, whether it's just migration or lift and shift, or whether it's actually, a modernization piece where you're looking to perhaps move to, say, I don't know, Azure Virtual Desktop or SQL Managed Instance, whatever it might be, different scenarios around that. And then ultimately it can facilitate the migration as well. So it will not only do the discovery and assessment and then essentially produce a business case in terms of what the options are, but it will then actually facilitate the migration for you as well. And that uses the sort of, if any of you remember the Azure Site Recovery or ASR feature from a few years ago, Microsoft essentially rolled that feature into Azure Migrate, which gives them that ability to sort of replicate workloads from on premises into Azure for the purposes of migration, and essentially that's what this is doing under the covers. It also gives you some flexibility around how you do it as well. So it supports agent-based and agentless. The difference is agent-based installs an agent on the server that you're intending to migrate, and then that essentially sends data to a process server, which then replicates the data or the workload into Azure, and then that will allow you to do the cutover and migration on that basis. Agentless is a little bit different in the sense that it relies on snapshots of the underlying hypervisor. So VMware, for example, will you connect to the VMware host, and then it will then allow you to snapshot essentially the disks into Azure. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility, I suppose, if you can't install agents on those servers. But I would say that the agent base is probably a little bit more reliable based on experience. How do I perform a database migration? So if you think about that previous slide, that's a little bit more about lift and shift. That's how do you get a server from on-prem into Azure. The DNS service is a little bit more fine-grained when it comes to for database workloads. So the Azure database, or the Azure data migration service, is again a PaaS native solution inside of Azure, and that enables us to essentially migrate databases from source to target server ultimately. There's just a couple of versions that you just need to be aware of. One is the classic and one is the current. So the existing one will be no longer, or the classic version will be retired on the 15th of March 2026, as it mentions there. So obviously look at using the Azure Data Migration Service, or the new variant of it, in any new workloads. But basically that allows us to move from things like SQL Server to SQL Managed Instance ultimately. So we can do that in an offline or an online fashion as well. We've used this countless times, and it is reliable, and obviously been around for a while now. So I would say that Microsoft have certainly fine-tuned it, and it is reliable. They've also extended that ability to something called the log replay service. So the log replay service is essentially a bunch of PowerShell scripts, or it's actually an API actually in many ways, but essentially Microsoft have essentially put a lot of the functionality for DNS, whilst it communicates with the API in Azure, there are essentially PowerShell modules that you can consume and then control the migration in a more fine-grained manner. So we did this for a fairly large retail client that had some specific needs around when the migration can happen and how often we were taking log backups and that kind of thing. So we use the log replay service, and we've wrapped that up into essentially an accelerator that we can now use within different clients that have got maybe similarly sized workloads. And I think in this case, this client had sort of 10 to 20 terabytes worth of data that we sort of moved over the course of, well, they had multiple instances, but ultimately the program of work was about 12 to 18 months, but we were using the log replay service to facilitate the migrations that we were doing over that period of time, because it just gave us a lot of control around the migration process itself. So a bit more fine-tuned control over that one, but certainly for, I would say, standard database workloads, the data migration service is a really good go-to for getting that done. So quick one on how we helped a client. So actually the one that I was referring to there, we've been working with them for probably 2 years, I would say, and they had a sort of a fairly sizable challenge in so much that they were running sort of very old legacy versions of SQL. If I remember correctly, I think it was SQL 2008 R2, and ultimately it was all on premises. There was a heap load of technical debt inside of the databases and the infrastructure. Ultimately, I think there are about 8 to 9 instances on this across a sort of 4 or 5 node cluster that they had on premises. The hardware was essentially out of date. It was all very, it was all very legacy ultimately. There were over 100 databases, if I recall correctly, and they were quite sizable. I think in total it was 20 to 30 terabytes of data. They had 5,500 SSIS packages, lots of cubes that were still using, that were multi-dimensional, they weren't tabular. And they had a bunch of SSRS reports as well. So there was lots of technical debt that had built up over 10, 20 plus years really, that they needed some help with and moving. One of their biggest challenges was that their batch processing was taking over a day, which meant that the insight and the analytics teams weren't able to essentially get the data it needed quick enough to be able to report back to the business. So that was a real problem, and quite often the batch processing would then interfere with BAU activities the following day, despite the fact it was started the evening prior. So lots of challenges there. So what did we do? Well, we did an assessment at the beginning initially, and made the decision that they needed to go to SQL Managed Instance. We knew that at the time that would be a very tall order and a big ask, because actually these were some fairly complex workloads, and at the time SQL managed instance was fairly stable, but we were still a little bit concerned about the potential performance needs for the workloads. But we did some refactoring, and we did some performance tuning and enhancements, and successfully migrated all those instances onto SQL MI. We introduced something called Resource Governor, and for any of you that are aware of that inside of SQL, it basically allows you to do a couple of things. One is throttle workloads depending on where it's coming from or who's running it, but it also allows us to classify the workloads coming in as well. So we use Resource Governor to build up essentially a report that enabled us to determine where the biggest hitting queries were coming from. And because based on the connection coming in, we were able to essentially classify where that workload was coming from, and then we could use that to target initiatives, whether it was around user training for SQL queries, or whether it was about application performance that we needed to advise and tune. So that it was actually a really useful feature in the end that we implemented. Data virtualization was another aspect. So what we did here was essentially move a lot of the archive data out. So old data that didn't need to be in the database, we moved onto Data Lake, and then we used Polybase and external tables to query that data in the SQL MI. So that basically meant that we used ADF to move old data onto a data lake in Parquet, and then we had essentially an archive database that, using external tables, pointed at the data on the data lake, and then we used T-SQL on the MI to essentially read that data on the data lake. So it essentially meant that, yes, the benefit there was that the people could still query the data as though they were using SQL, but the benefit, they have the cost benefit of not having to store that data inside of the database or on SQL MI, which is actually more costly when compared to storing it on a data lake. So that's what we did for archive data. We introduced delayed durability to improve some of the batch processing times, particularly for staging databases where actually, if there was if the instance crashed, we weren't too bothered about whether or not the data in that staging database was persisted or not, because we could just rerun the batch and it would be staging. So there were some optimizations there that we made. We upped the compatibility level of the databases to 150. We set up Query Store for effective performance, essentially monitoring and troubleshooting, and we implemented some cost optimizations as well, as we discussed on the previous slide there. So the benefits were that we ended up with a significant amount, and I can't quite remember how much, but I think it was something like 10 terabytes in the end archived. They saw a pretty big improvement in their performance, their batch times of 25 to 50%, and in that period they were hitting some record times for their batch processing times. So the business was super pleased with obviously the migration itself, but also the benefits, because ultimately it meant that the data was ready much sooner for reporting to take place. There was better performance insight. So as a result of the work that we did with Resource Governor, I suppose the analytics team, well, I'd say that the BI team and the DBAs were actually pleased with the fact that they had better performance insight into how those managed instances were actually performing and where the workload was coming from and where the big hitters were. We improved total cost of ownership. That reduced, so ultimately they were no longer needing to worry about backups and all of the other stuff that comes along with administering and managing a data platform. And they could scale as well. This particular client were in retail, and they were able to scale very, very quickly and elastically, because they're on SQL MI, and so they could scale for peak events like Black Friday and other events that require it. So overall, really successful project. The client was super happy, yeah, that was a good example there of how we help the client modernize their environment. Okay, last couple of slides here then. So just a little bit around our approach to sort of SQL modernization. And we've been doing this for a long time, and we've got lots of people that have again been doing this for a long time. And we followed and defined define and follow a framework essentially that is what you're seeing on the screen right now. And this is tried and tested, and ultimately it works. We start with a discovery and assessment exercise to essentially help build a business case. And that's followed on with a solution architecture design that we work in collaboration with the technical teams on the client side. We build the environment. We go through a period of transformation and migration where we might need to make performance optimizations, or we might need to refactor some of the workloads depending on the compatibility and whether or not certain tables or certain workloads can move onto a PaaS platform. So we'll often work with the technical teams there to refactor them if we need to, and then we'll support the migration, which is quite often an out of hours piece of work, certainly for productions type workloads. So we'll work with the team and own that migration as well, so that we perform that successfully, and then we'll hand that into support. Now, whether or not that's the support on the client side, or whether it's something that the client would want to work with us on, because we have a managed service team, that support could be backed off to our managed services business, who can then obviously maintain that solution and optimize it throughout the lifetime of that contract. So yeah, a tried and proven and tested framework that we've leveraged over over the last sort of 50 years. Niall, so that's everything from me. I'll let Niall cover off this slide, and then we can move on to some questions if there are any.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, thank you for that. That was a great session, and I hope everybody who's attended see some real benefit in understanding a bit more about what you've been speaking about. You're probably wondering, kind of where can Coeo help and what can we do? So if you are in a position, or you're kind of in the early stages of discussing internally or even externally your migration options, get in touch with us. We'd love to be in that part of that conversation and having discussions with various different organisations. We are having what we call our half-day Azure SQL modernisation workshops. So if off the back of this conversation and webinar you'd like to discuss a bit more about that, and understand how we could provide one of those workshops for you, if you meet the eligibility criteria, then reach out. We'll go through with someone like maybe potentially like Matt, or another AI and Microsoft data specialist to provide some expert guidance. We'll be able to assist you in creating a plan and looking at what that modernisation roadmap looks like, and personalised advice around how we can help your business case. It's not kind of one size fits all. Everybody's going to be very different, and then looking at the longer term. So how are you going to be managing this? Do you need some assistance from a managed service? And then projecting your costs. We understand that the operational cost for moving to Azure might be a key factor in making that decision, so that will be all covered under the workshops. And reach out to ourselves, and we can have a conversation around how we can assist. And I think just if you want to move on to the next, and we'll go into some questions. We do have a question and answers box in the top corner if there is any external questions, which I think at the moment, we've just got one from Gemma there, just to outline that. So just first off, I think I do have a question for you, Matt, which I think would be really interesting. Something that I'm seeing a lot with current customers who are in this process is, what are some of the considerations when migrating to Azure SQL MI as opposed to IaaS, which is obviously the SQL Server on VMs. So yeah, it'd be good to understand a bit more about that if possible.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So yeah, so migrating to SQL managed instances and SQL VMs, and earlier in the slides there, I think I mentioned that the chasm that used to exist between the products has reduced quite considerably, to the point where there's broad feature parity between the two. That said, there are still some considerations, and one of the things that we often find is that there is still some potential refactoring that needs to take place. And one of the biggest things that we end up hitting actually is the TLS requirement. So actually, many of you will probably know that at the end of October, or certainly from the 1st of November, Microsoft are essentially only going to allow them a minimum version of TLS 1.2 a lot across their workloads. Now, what we've found quite often is that certainly for legacy workloads or legacy applications and servers and whatnot, they don't always necessarily have the correct version, or they don't have the up-to-date versions of TLS. So what we've often found when we're migrating, let's say, the database backend to SQL MI, and the migration isn't changing, we have found previously that we've hit issues with versions of TLS that's required us to go and actually do some updates on the application side to essentially update the cryptographic providers to support TLS 1.2. So that's, I think, probably the biggest I wouldn't say blocker, because we overcame it, but it's one of the biggest considerations that needs to be made is, what versions of TLS are applications using to connect, because SQL managed instance only allows from the 1st of November, it's only going to allow 1.2. So that's a big consideration. I put something out on LinkedIn as well about that not long ago. So I would say that's a fairly big consideration. I think the other thing as well is around testing too. So obviously, when we're replatforming, or if we're doing a lift and shift, generally speaking, unless there's a good reason, we don't usually require a sort of a large phase of testing. Yes, we'll probably need to do some failover testing, but in terms of application functionality and performance, typically speaking, unless there's a good reason to, we found that we don't really need to do that. Now, when we go into SQL managed instance or we're modernizing, that changes the game and the picture a little bit, because ultimately we not only need to do a failover test, but actually quite often we need to do some performance testing too, because ultimately we've selected essentially a tier based on some data that we've captured during the discovery and the assessment exercise, but we need to validate some of that ultimately. So I think it really depends on the size and scale of the workload, but ultimately with SQL, when we go to SQL MI, we generally require a little bit more extensive testing than we might do in other scenarios. So I think those are, for me, probably the biggest, the biggest differences and considerations.
Awesome, thank you, Matt. I'll open the floor up for the last couple of minutes if anybody does have any questions. If not to worry, and if you do finish the session and something springs to mind, we're more than happy for you to reach out to ourselves. You can see there Matt's got his email on there, and I think we'll be following up off the back of the session. So yeah, don't worry if you can't think of anything right now. Just a signpost as well, if you are only been able to send partly of this, has been recorded, so it will be sent out also, and if you want to pass on to your team. So like I say, thank you all for joining. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you on the next session.
Thanks, Niall.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.